Thank you. With a title like that, it wouldn't make it as a bestseller. But that's what it is. I wanted to talk to you about how the common roots of the Abrahamic tradition can be used to bring us closer together. When I was growing up, my father always used to say that we are the people of the book. I originally thought that just meant that we had more books than everybody else, and then later I realized that the people of the book had a very special meaning. And as you know, in Islam, the people of the book have a privileged position. So let's go back to that. Let's forget about the clash of civilizations for the moment, and let's just remember that civilizations have been with us for a long time, and they have mixed and merged and surely clashed, but certainly also emerged from clash, sometimes stronger. And let's remember that the people of the book invoked the idea that we have a common heritage in a particular cultural, I'll call it artifact, without implying any disrespect to the sacred book. And the book is without question a locus of a common heritage. Christians and Jews share the Old Testament, evidently a more Christian conception, old versus new. The Jews have other names for the various books, but it was indeed a common heritage. But I have to admit that I don't much care for the idea of the Abrahamic tradition, and not merely because Abraham was male. Some of my best friends are male. It's rather that Abraham was a human being, a person, and it prevents us from understanding the spiritual basis of that religion's message, which I consider to be the principal message, which is the spiritual equality of all human beings. Now, it is actually, in my opinion, much earlier that we find that common root. It is the book of Genesis. And in fact, specifically in the story of the creation of Adam and Eve, of the humanity. And that story, which you all know, is far, far more complex and frankly interesting than I think most people realize. It was also a bit of a surprise to me when I've spoken about this to a lot of people. Oh, who doesn't know the story of Adam and Eve? I mean, hey, right? Not many people realize that there are two versions of creation. One in book 1, which most people are familiar with, very familiar with, which is as follows. Then God said, let us make man, Adam, and that, by the way, is not a proper name, it's Adam, mankind, man, in our image, after our likeness. And let them, plural all of a sudden, have dominion. And God created him, Adam, in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. It was not long, though, before this version was eclipsed by the other version, which everybody knows is Eve coming later, possibly from the rib of Adam, in Genesis 2 and 3. That is the story most people seem to recall. But in fact, the idea that Eve came later has presented a number of problems. I cannot help but point out that a very minority view holds that to actually prove the superiority of Eve, because you see, she was the only one who was not made out of dust. She was made from another human being. But much as I personally like that very much, it's not as popular. Anyway, that's just a footnote. The discrepancy between the two versions led to a fascinating interpretation in the Jewish tradition, which I have to say a huge number of Jews are unaware of. And that interpretation sought to reconcile them by positing that at first, God created both male and female, and they were equal. And the name of the first woman was Lilith. Now, that is a name that I think most people know because there is a Lilith in the, later in the Bible, but only once or twice. It was, the idea was that they were equal, but Lilith was assertive. She was, well, let's just say she was a pain in the neck. And before too awfully long, she just decided she's going to leave, and Adam was alone again. And so then God created a second wife for him, Eve. And Eve was quiet. She was submissive, and that was just fine. If you think this is a bit bizarre, just remember how very deeply rooted the conception of female subservience to males actually is. But I have to tell you, I'm not particularly concerned about feminism here, about equality of male and female. Most important is the idea that God created mankind, male and female, in his image, and it is the love, the bond between male and female, between human beings generally, that is the image of God. We're not talking about an imprint, a literal imprint, needless to say. I spent several chapters elaborating on this, but I will spare you because I want to go directly to what I found quite astonishing and very hopeful. Namely, that in the Quran, the rendition of this particular story, namely the creation of Adam and Eve, is the most egalitarian. In the Quran, Surah 4:1, humanity is said to have been created by God from a single soul. And I quote for you one of the translations. They're all pretty much similar, but I do not speak Arabic, so here it is. O people, fear your Lord, who hath created you of one soul, and of him created his wife, and from these twain hath spread abroad so many men and women. And another passage from Surah 7:189 repeats, he it is who did create you from a single soul, and from him brought forth his wife that he might dwell with her. And the bringing forth of the woman could well have been simultaneous. The idea is created you from a single soul. And the work of men and women is appreciated equally. To those who beseech God to be merciful, the Lord answers them, I will not suffer the work of him among you that worketh, whether male or female, to be lost. The one of you is the issue of the other. The one of you is the issue of the other. Again, the order is not significant. You also probably know that when God summoned the first couple to him and asked them what happened with the forbidden fruit, he chastised the male, not the female. That's a mixed blessing. Might be said that showed less concern for the female. I kind of like that. He is the one who had originally been told he's the one who is responsible. But in any case, it's a detail. The point is that there is no misogyny implicit in the Quranic rendition of this particular story. When in the past I have presented this, and it's not for nothing that I've written many, many pages about this. It does require a whole lot of research and a lot of scholars who do speak Arabic, who might quote and so forth. Bottom line is, people ask me, yeah, but what about these other places in the Quran? And they cite me what, we always hear about how women are inferior and you can beat them and whatever. There's a great deal in every sacred book that is difficult to reconcile with other parts. And by no means do I suggest that there aren't other parts of the Quran that can be interpreted differently. But this particular essence of what it means to be human, it seems to me, is at the very heart of Islamic philosophy. Barbara Fryer Stowesser, if you don't mind my quoting a little, writes that classical Muslim interpretations of the Quranic story distort the original script in numerous ways. It did not take long for the Islamic tradition to turn misogynist. She writes, extraneous detail transmitted in hadith form and frequently originating in the Bible and Bible-related sources not only fleshes out the story, but dramatically changes it, especially with regard to the woman's role. Specifically, medieval interpretation of women's origin and nature denies female rationality and female moral responsibility. So as a result, we all know the women's that women's subservient, inferior place in society was institutionalized and justified with a presumed weight of divine accusation. The hadith materials on women's inferior nature were accepted and propagated by the consensus, Ishma, of the learned doctors of law and theology until 18th century pre-modern reformists began to question their authoritative status. And to my surprise, pleasant surprise, there are a very relatively, I should say but relatively large number of scholars who are resurrecting the original conception of the story of creation. And it was followed a century later, and again at the end of 20th century, by new studies that boldly return to the original text. In other words, it is the self-proclaimed fundamentalists, the extremist Islamist clerics, who stand accused of engaging in a distorted reading of the Holy Book, charged with blatant blasphemy. Yes, I assure you that this raises a lot of eyebrows in many audiences. And it seems to me that it is a source of great hope. But I'm not going to leave it at biblical exegesis, because as this conference has indicated, as everything we know about human beings shows, ideas in an ethereal fashion will not change the world. They have to be translated either by politicians, God help us, or by artists, and not necessarily for the good, but very often for the good. And it is and I have selected to end one symbol of Islamic culture that I consider to be the most dramatic, and that frankly has had the greatest influence on my life, because it was the very first book that I have read about Islam. And that is the story of Scheherazade. You all know that Scheherazade was the legendary Persian woman who represents, in the words of Fatima Mernissi, a symbol of Islam's genius as a pluralist religion and culture, unfolding in a territory that stretches from Mali and Morocco on the Atlantic coast of North Africa to India, Mongolia, and China. But she adds that the startling observation that the tale's cosmopolitan grace, their capacity to transcend cultural boundaries, does not extend to the relationship between the sexes. And it is interesting, of course, that Scheherazade confronts head-on the disparate power between male and female. Her husband, the king, is about to kill her, as he has done with thousands of other women, by way of retribution against the treachery of his wife. But Scheherazade does have something that is extremely powerful, and that is her mind, her stories, her ability to translate the myriad aspects of what it means to be human in such a stunningly powerful way that she saves herself. And in this process, she saves him as well. He was spiraling down in a destructive fashion. I really liked the passage that from Shusha Guppy, a really wonderful book, The Secret of Laughter, Magical Tales from Classical Persia. I invite you to read it. She's an Iranian-born British writer. She calls Scheherazade the archetypal example of a woman who thought the magic of storytelling saves her life and changes her own destiny and the course of events, and inspires Persian women to overcome their patriarchal society. She said, throughout history, these women had to rely on the strength of their character and inner resources, and they drew on a variety of stratagems to survive and exercise power. One of the most effective of these was the telling and spinning of stories. And since most of the population was unlettered, they didn't read, they passed them down the generations by word of mouth. They were the guardians of memory. As such, women played the roles of Homer, Thucydides, Herodotus, Shakespeare, and the unnamed biblical chronicles, constituting, in her words, not only the biological mother of the nation, but the creators and transmitters of its cultural inheritance. Their handicap, illiteracy, political and economic ostracism, and domestic isolation, became their principal tool in fulfilling Eve's original destiny. You know the meaning of her name. She was the mother of mankind, the creator, and, in the case of Scheherazade, the preserver of human experience. And again, going back to Fatima Mernissi, oh, yes, her book, if you haven't read it, it's called Scheherazade Goes West. Somebody here has read it? Oh, it's a little book, and it is, you can't put it down. It's very amusing. It's also very serious. She compares misogyny East and West without, rancor. She's not against the West, against the East. It's just very, very interesting. Anyway, sorry, professors, we have to give like a reading list. So back to Fatima. Oh, yes, I have just a couple of minutes. She defines the importance of Scheherazade in Muslim culture like this: to understand the emergence of the storyteller as a symbol of human rights, see, I told you we're coming to human rights, in the modern Orient, one has to remember that for centuries, the conservative elite, with a few exceptions, scorned the 1001 Nights as popular trash of no cultural value whatsoever, because the tales were transmitted orally and hence a symbol of the uneducated classes. The reason for its secondary place is to be found in the specific style, which is primarily oral, as I was saying. Suspicion of fictional narratives as frivolous was widespread. In fact, one explanation for the combination of genres, adventure or quest, alongside moralizing, was to, quote, entertain audience while fending off criticisms from religious scholars and legal authorities. Consisting of pre-Islamic Arab materials, which from the start competed with a Persian material, the first version of Arabian Nights has been estimated to date as far back as the late 8th century. Muhammad himself was said to have loved many of these tales, as did his beloved wife Aisha and the other members of his harem. Scheherazade herself has become an idol for Muslims. You have probably read, again, if you haven't, you must, reading Lolita in Tehran, where Azad Nassisi, on several occasions, talks about Scheherazade as being a symbol for herself and for her friends, for Muslim women, certainly Persian women. But I especially, thinking of how I wanted to end this, this presentation to you, which is very hard. The worst thing that you can do, it's very cruel and unusual punishment, to a professor is to have them speak for less than 55 minutes. So please feel for me. I'm not used to speaking quite so short, but I have to read this to you because it's wonderful. Little Fatima Mernisi asks her Aunt Mina, why can't men and women keep on playing together even when they're older? Why the separation? She's not given an explanation because there isn't one. Mina says sadly that as soon as little girls and boys are separated, a cosmic frontier splits the planet in two halves. The frontier indicates the line of power because wherever there's a frontier, there are two kinds of creatures walking on Allah's earth, the powerful on one side, the powerless on the other. Little Fatima's question, how she could find out on which side she stood, is answered very easily. If you can't get out, you are on the powerless side. And she decided that she was going to be like Scheherazade. She was going to write. And that is quite literally what she did, and that is very seriously what she did. She would eventually get out by trespassing with her mind, which sets us all free. Thank you.